Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, The Health Impact of Cell Phone Radiation, What We Know Now. My name is Michelle Dixon and I am the Program and Development Director for the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us for this important discussion. I am very pleased to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Deborah Lee Davis. An award-winning scientist and author, Dr. Davis is the president and founder of the Environmental Health Trust, which provides research and education on environmental hazards and promotes constructive policies locally, nationally, and internationally. Among Dr. Davis's numerous accomplishments, she has authored more than 200 technical publications and 3 books. She is the founding director of the Center for Environmental Oncology at the University of Pittsburgh Cancer Institute and the founding director of the Board on Environmental Studies and Toxicology for the National Academy of Sciences. Currently, Dr. Davis is visiting professor of medicine at Hebrew University. Dr. Davis, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to be speaking with my colleagues at the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition. That's where a lot of wonderful things have started, including the Silent Spring Institute and efforts to promote awareness of the environmental causes of breast cancer. The environment and health is something that I've worked on for many years, and I just want to share with you that my book in 2002 had a chapter on the new sisterhood of breast cancer, which featured some of the work that was done in Massachusetts. And in The Secret History of the War on Cancer, I talked further about what we knew and what we did not do about avoidable causes of breast cancer. The most recent book I've written is Disconnect, The Truth About Cell Phone Radiation. It's available on Amazon, and it really documents the long history of research in this field and efforts to undercut it and undermine it that have been very successful until this date. And I'm going to share with you today some of the latest science, and you'll understand why we now have more information than we had 10 years ago, and we have enough information to know why we need to act now to prevent exposures that are taking place in our homes, our schools, and workplaces. I'm not going to go over my qualifications because I think they're well known to many of you. I would just say that having spent a lot of time in my career in science, I understand what it takes to do good science, and recently have been involved with the journal Environmental Research in a special issue on wireless radiation in health. So there is a substantial body of peer-reviewed science that I'm going to be referencing in my talk today. I wanted to share with you first, though, your origins here, the Women's Community Cancer Project, which was a thrill when it happened. I remember how exciting it was for all of us to see women demanding to know the full truth and demanding that we do a better job of understanding the relationship between the environment and breast cancer. And the reason for that demand has been very simple. About 1 in 10 cases of breast cancer occurs in women who were born with a genetic defect that they inherited from their father or mother. And that means that most women who get breast cancer are born with healthy genes, and yet something happens to cause them to develop the disease. We know the environment is important, and we further know that when we look at the known risk factors, which include pollution and cosmetics and cleaning products, that most of them are related to an increase in the lifetime exposure to hormones, or xenoestrogens, which was the subject of my last talk before you about a year ago. So we have ample information on the importance of these factors linking together the risks for breast cancer. The more hormones, the higher the level of estrogen in a woman's lifetime, the greater her chance of developing breast cancer. And that's been established through many, many studies that I referenced in my previous talk that is available online. Now, with respect to the electromagnetic spectrum, we're often not even clear what it entails. And this diagram taken from EPA shows you that it goes all the way from the power lines that are allowing you to plug into your computers right now to the ultraviolet and cosmic radiations and X-rays at the other end of the spectrum. They're all part of radiation. Non-ionizing radiation references microwaves, ovens, cell phones, baby monitors, and wireless devices. And it used to be thought that because this was a relatively weak form of radiation, it could only cause a problem if it was at a high enough power to create heat. That idea has been superseded by more advanced science, some of which I'm going to show you today, that clearly shows that weak levels of electromagnetic radiation from microwave technology can be damaging to biological systems. If you look here at this visualization, what you see is that radiation can vary not just with its power. For example, the microwave oven uses 1,000 watts and your phone uses less than 1 watt, but with its frequency, that is how fast it is moving, its amplitude, its pulse. And what we know from all of this is that the complexity of the radiation is what we have to consider when evaluating its impact, and not just the fact that it may be of relatively lower power. So when you hear that power is low for new technologies, that's not enough information, because within a 4-second phone call, you can get tremendous variation, and it's the variation over time that we believe is biologically most important. Now, the safety limits, so to speak, for testing phones were set in 1996. The typical user was a big guy who didn't talk very much, 6 minutes. Several expert groups have reviewed these standards, which are 20 years old, and now have said they are inadequate, particularly for children. The American Academy of Pediatrics, the US Government Accountability Office have all made that determination, and yet we are still using the same safety standards for testing phones today that we used 20 years ago. Now, would you want to fly in a plane or drive in a car with 20-year-old safety standards? And yet that's what we're doing with our cell phones and other wireless devices. In fact, cell phones are two-way microwave radios. They are designed to send and receive radio frequency radiation by connecting to a cell tower or a base station. Even when you're not talking on your phone is always on unless it's on airplane mode or turned off. And that means that you're constantly getting signals coming into you if you keep the phone next to your body, as I'm going to show you in a moment. The antennas of phones used to be outside. And in fact, the old phones seen on the far left were extremely hot, but they were not used very often because 20 years ago, phones cost thousands of dollars to use and operate. And the only people that had phones at that time were military and medical folks. I remember my father was so excited to have a portable phone. And he worked for the US Army Reserves for many years. That's what the standards were set for people working in the military, because in fact, those were the first users of the technology. Now, what we know from studies that I've done with my colleagues in Brazil is by modeling exposure, half of the radiation from your phone can be absorbed into the head or body or wherever it's stored, including, unfortunately, in the bra. And we know that cell phone radiation enters the brain or the breast when it's held close to it. And you can see here this animation, again from our colleagues at Porto Alegre, shows you the absorption into the head of a 6-year-old. And the yellow-white is the hottest, or so to speak, it's not hot in temperature, but it's the highest levels of radiation measured in terms of volts per meter of absorption. And you can see here that this gets substantially into the head of a child. Now, the breast is, of course, different because it's mostly fat. And fat has been called a natural hazardous waste site, but it also will absorb microwave radiation, which is why you can heat things in a microwave oven. But a phone, again, is too weak to heat things, but it has other effects. Now, in case you think that this is a trivial matter, I want to show you now, with this on the screen of your iPhone. You go to your iPhone and you go to Settings, and if you click on Settings and go down to General, which you'll see here, and then go up to About, and then go from there all the way down to something you will not have seen usually, which is Legal. And you click on Legal, you'll get to RF exposure, and there you will find the advice that you were given. And that advice is to stop, to understand that phones are working, and that so long as they are on, they are emitting radiation, and that they are tested at 5 millimeters off of the body. That's the important thing to realize. All phones are tested away from the body. Now, the iPhone says it's tested at 5 millimeters. Others are tested at a greater distance. So all phones contain this information about how to reduce exposure using a hands-free option or the built-in speakerphone or headphones. And they also warn that if you have cases with metal parts, it can actually alter the amount of radiation that you're exposed to. So the interesting thing is that the new phones, of course, don't just work on one transmission level. They can work on 4 or 5 at the same time because they have antennas for voice and antennas for music and antennas for photos. And all of those things can be operating together, which means you have simultaneous exposures, and yet they're tested in this old-fashioned 20-year-old way. Now I want to tell you about a number of Sentinel cases, and I want to specify we do not have epidemiologic studies here, but we have ample reasons for concern because we're looking not just at the human data, which I'm about to show you, but at the experimental data that provides further support for the hypothesis that cell phone radiation is in fact a significant cause of breast cancer, particularly for those who keep a phone in their bra. This is a young woman who was Chinese American, which, as many of you know, that means she had a very low risk of breast cancer. But she kept the phone in her bra while driving. And that's important because when you're driving, if your phone is not hooked up to your car antenna, it is constantly sending a signal to the tower and going to maximum power whenever it moves from one cell zone to another. So she's driving around with a phone in her bra, and she developed tumors right under where the phone antenna were located. It was a stunning discovery of my colleague, Dr. Robert Nagorny, who was a brilliant oncologist in California. So the tumors were developed right under where the phone was stored, and several of these women have been written up in a case series report. No family history, no inherited risk factors, and what we have here is unusual tumors, multiple, sometimes multifocal, meaning, as you can see here in the lower image, tumors occurring in different places that are separate from one another, but all corresponding to underneath the antenna of the phone. And my colleagues, Dr. John West and others, reported on 4 of these cases. We, at one point, had more than 38 of them, but unfortunately, we were not able to get good pathology confirmation on them. So we have not been able to do the additional report. I continue to get reports regularly from young women who have developed breast cancer with having kept the phone in their bra. So it's obviously something we should be concerned about. And I would say, as a public health person, we should not insist on epidemiologic proof of harm before trying to take steps to reduce exposures now, particularly in light of the fact that the manufacturers tell people that they shouldn't keep phones close to the body. And women have no idea. It's very convenient to put a phone there, that what they're doing is providing a weak microwave radiation into vulnerable breast tissue. This is the MRI of a 21-year-old. Now, as you all know, 21-year-olds are not supposed to get breast cancer. And she unfortunately had multifocal tumors, and you see here, unfortunately, some metastases, at diagnosis with no family history and no risk factors whatsoever. One of the things we know about the breast is that it has a very high dielectric constant, meaning it can absorb microwave radiation much more readily than other parts of the body. The brain is protected by the skull, which does absorb radiation, but at a lower rate than the brain itself. The breast is not protected at all, and it's mostly fat, which of course absorbs microwave radiation readily. Now, this is a very interesting figure that I've adapted that could explain what's going on, so bear with me while I try to walk through it. Microwave radiation and light at night and electromagnetic radiation can suppress melatonin. Melatonin is a very powerful antioxidant that we make naturally when we sleep in the dark. It's been considered an oncostatic compound. That is, actually can arrest cancer and is being used now at the National Cancer Institute in trials as an adjunct to chemotherapy and as an attempt to see its usefulness for treatment for breast cancer and other forms of cancer as well. So what we know is that blue light, particularly at night, that is at 440 nanometers, alters pineal function. The pineal gland, if you will, is deep within the brain, and yet light affects it. That's been well known for quite some time. And the result of exposure to blue light and to microwaves is to reduce melatonin in the body. So if you don't sleep in the dark, if you have exposures, if you have your device, if your children are sleeping with your devices, I hope that this talk will convince you that that should end now. Because what happens, we know, is that melatonin secretion affects the hypothalamus and the ovaries. It's called the hypothalamo-gonadal pituitary axis, a fancy term that simply means that we connect how our hormones are regulated through our reproductive organs. And ultimately, this can lead to follicle-stimulating hormone and other things that will increase breast tissue stimulation and increase breast cancer. That's, in fact, a framework that I think is quite relevant to what we're seeing here. And I speak as a toxicologist that has developed these theories. But frankly, I think as a public health person, I don't want to see us wait and insist on proof of further human harm before taking steps to keep our children and young women safe from this ill-advised use of cell phones. Because breast cancer is what we can see developing if we have prolonged stimulation of breast tissue. Now, this is another framework that shows you what I was just talking about. As light hits the eye, it sends a message to the pineal gland in the brain. And during daytime, you get a lower level of melatonin, so you're awake. But lower levels of melatonin than you need at night have been associated with an increase in estrogen at night, which has been linked to breast cancer in several studies that have been published in women. So we know, for example, that blind women naturally have relatively lower rates of breast cancer than sighted women. And again, the theory is it's because they naturally have more melatonin circulating throughout their bodies, and more melatonin at night is protective against breast cancer and other diseases. This is a very important study that was published recently, and it shows that melatonin inhibits the expression of cancer-causing genes in breast cancer cells. And the slide on the left shows you the controls, and these are cancer cells, and then you see the effect of various levels of melatonin to suppress the cancer cell growth. And the opposite over here, you're seeing the controls that have less growth. This is a breast restriction compound and restricts the development of cancer. And you see that with more melatonin, you get an increase in this restrictive enzyme over controls. So this is an indication at the level of the cell of the importance of melatonin. And I could show you similar things about the importance of electromagnetic fields for accelerating the growth of breast cancer. So as to mechanisms that could be involved, there have been a number of theories. This one comes from Breast Cancer Choices, that it leads to downregulation and reduction of the amount of estrogen if it's not at the adequate level during night. And melatonin is concentrated in the breast, where it can reduce the estrogen receptor and sensitivity to estrogen. Remember, xenoestrogens are in fact a key component of many environmental causes of breast cancer. And melatonin is essential to preventing an excess amount of xenoestrogens. Now, we continue to have what I tried working on when I worked for President Clinton, unexplained patterns of cancer in Black and white women. And I just want to make sure you are aware of this. You see here that Black incidence is lower than white for breast cancer. And this is from 1975 currently. The difference has become less, but it's not less important. And yet deaths are higher for Blacks than whites. We don't have an explanation for this. I've worked on a number of theories over the years, but I want to share with you some new evidence that I think suggests that one of the explanations for this might be due to the fact that Black women tend to use cell phones and other devices more than whites. If you look at cell phone use for Blacks and Hispanics compared to whites, according to the Pew Research Center, you see that Blacks are heavier users about cell phones than whites. Now, I do not mean to suggest that this explains all of the difference, but I think it certainly is worthwhile pursuing. And again, while we do the research, I urge everyone listening here to take steps now to reduce your exposures, and I will tell you at the end how to go about doing that. The World Health Organization in 2011 determined, based on all the evidence available at that time, that cell phone radiation was possibly carcinogenic to humans, based on epidemiologic studies available at that time, showing an increase in glioma, a malignant type of brain cancer that develops in the glial cells of the brain, as well as increase in acoustic neuroma, which is the hearing nerve, which is obviously most exposed when you hold a phone next to your head. So based on that, they reached that conclusion in 2011. Since then, my colleagues and I have reviewed all of the epidemiology that has been developed, which are 9 case control studies and 2 flawed cohort studies, and looked at the toxicology evidence, some of which I'm going to show you next. And we have concluded that there is clear evidence that cell phone radiation is a human carcinogen. And Anthony B. Miller, is the lead author of this paper. Dr. Miller is a distinguished epidemiologist and has been an advisor to the World Health Organization for decades, as well as an award-winning scientist who has done important work on mammography. And he has published more than 600 publications. So his authorship of this new paper on this topic is particularly noteworthy and important, because he has concluded that cell phone radiation is a human carcinogen. And just to give you some idea of the data that were involved in the consideration of this, if you look at the odds ratio, which is the relative risk of getting glioma in people who are using phones at various levels, you see here, unfortunately, that those who have used phones for 25 years or more have the highest risk compared to those who've only used phones for 1 to 5 or 10 years. This is a very strong indication that there is a real association here. Further, Hargel has shown in brilliant work that unfortunately no one else has yet replicated, that children who begin to use phones regularly have 4 to 8-fold increased risk of glioma 20 to 30 years later. And he is the only researcher to have produced that kind of analysis. In the United States today, we have no studies going on now on this topic, despite the incredibly extensive use of phones taking place in our country and in our schools. I should add that France has recently banned cell phones for children aged 16 and younger. And they've done this for several different reasons, one of which relates to the radiation exposures that are taking place, and the other of which relates to the distracting and ways in which phones interfere with education. This is similar data for acoustic neuroma. And again, if you look at the very bottom, you see that the highest risk is for those who've used phones for 20 years or more, a 4-fold increased risk. And the confidence interval is from 2.2 to 9, meaning that the real number could be as low as 2.2 or as high as 9. And this, again, this is a tumor that is considered benign, but the surgery to remove it can be disabling, and it can often result in significant hearing loss. So now let's look at what the animals tried to tell us. We've just seen what some of the human epidemiologic data show with respect to glioma. We do not have those data with respect to breast cancer. And as far as I know, there's no effort to get it. But I'm hoping that after this seminar, those of you listening who have reason for concern about your breast cancer or those you know that might have developed from use of a phone will contact the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition so that we can get a larger group of people identified. What we know from animal studies is that every agent proven to cause cancer in people will produce it in animals when adequately tested. We also know that rodents and humans don't differ very much in terms of their DNA. And as a result of this, the World Health Organization and the National Toxicology Program state that any agent that we know causes cancer in animals should be regarded as if it can cause it in humans. Because again, every agent that we know causes cancer in people does produce it in animals when adequately tested. So we have to regard animal test results as important to tell us about human risk so that we can predict the risk and prevent it, not so that we can wait to collect the data and prove people are at risk. Now, this is what the National Toxicology Program recently released, and they're going to be issuing their final report 3 years after they first released these data, because they have undergone an unprecedented level of scrutiny and peer review due to the level of interest in these findings. But what they have shown is that there's a significant increase in rare cancers that are quite malignant. Cancer of the brain, glioma, which is very unusual in animals, is significantly elevated in the National Toxicology Program. Schwannoma of the heart, which is a tumor around the nerve in the center of the heart, is significantly elevated in the National Toxicology Program study. In addition, they show heart damage, that is cardiomyopathy, and DNA damage is also shown in mice and rats in multiple organs. So because of these findings, normally the US government would be conducting a risk assessment and taking steps to reduce exposures. But these are not normal times, as I need not remind you. And so we're left with flying blind on much of this. This is from the CBC, and I invite you to listen for a moment.
This is why she argues phones should be tested the way we wear them. So what happens when they are? So the tests are all done.
Tests are all finished.
And?
The number exceeded the limit. It went up significantly with each one of the
phones. That's right. The phones exceeded the safety limit when they were moved right against the body. The radiation absorbed increased 3 to 4 times.
3 to 4 times. 3 to 4 times. That means that every time you have your phone next to your head, in your bra or in your pocket, you are getting 3 to 4 times the recommended levels that were set 20 years ago. Now, I recently met with the director of the French National Agency that evaluates radiation for the entire country of France. He has a PhD in radiation physics. They conducted tests of 442 phones, and they found that 9 out of 10 of them exceeded their test limits, which, by the way, are higher than ours. So this is the recommendation for manufacturers of testing at 10 millimeters. And that number on the right is a measure of the absorption of radiation. Let me go back. This is the level at 5 millimeters. And next, you see the level at body contact. At body contact, you can see that it exceeds the recommended levels several-fold. And because of that, the French government is in the process of recalling phones. This is a rather important development. Now, I showed you before that children will absorb much higher radiation. Their skulls are thinner, their brain contains more fluid, and therefore they can absorb more radiation. The breast absorbs even more because it doesn't have even a thin skull to protect it. This is the warning in the LG phone. So it's not just Apple, it's every phone that has information about the test distance. And by the way, this is because phones are tested in the equivalent of a holster off the body. Now, nobody is using a holster nowadays, and people are not aware that a phone is tested almost a ½ inch off the body. And if phones were tested the way they're used, like the French just did, they violate the current safety standards. Now, because of this development, the citizens of Berkeley, California, have passed the Cell Phone Right to Know Ordinance, which says if you carry or use your phone in your pants or shirt pocket or tucked into a bra when the phone is on and connected to a wireless network, you can exceed the federal guidelines. They actually had to strike the idea that the potential risk is greater for children, but in fact, you see that it is. And this ordinance turned out to be even more important than the people developing it might have anticipated. So far, the industry has objected. They've filed lawsuits, and this has gone to the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. And so far, the courts have upheld the right of Berkeley to give people the information so that they can know before they buy a phone that there are safer ways to use it. And that's why we want to work with you to see that this Berkeley Right to Know ordinance becomes an ordinance throughout our country. Now, small cells are not small. That is the term you will be hearing in your communities for the deployment of the new 5G system. 5G is a technology that doesn't exist yet, that is being developed and being experimented on in real time. I'm going to ask Theodora if you're able to come into the call now. And
yes, hello.
Yes, could you please explain what 5G is, and I will drive through the next slide.
Okay, 5G is the new technology that will tie together the Internet of Things, and it will incorporate both current frequencies in use as well as higher frequencies, sub-millimeter and millimeter waves. I apologize, but I can't get the screen up right now. Can you
it says
Continue why.
no pre-market safety testing, all right? And more importantly, what we know is that you cannot deploy 5G. It won't be possible in countries that have precautionary radiation limits. That's what industry themselves have said. And why is that? Theodora, I'm sorry I should have introduced you, is the executive director of Environmental Health Trust and has been in the front line of communicating to the public and about 5G, and just most recently spoke before Montgomery County citizens groups that are on record as opposing this, because it could, for example, result in 16 poles in a single block right now. And there's pending legislation and a rule from the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, that would in fact exempt the industry from having to have anything to consider about where they locate these things. There's a website called Telecom Power Grab that goes into some detail about this. But basically, we are in a situation where in some countries with protective radiation limits, significantly below the ones that have been set by an international group that is heavily influenced by industry called ICNIRP, the rollout of 5G could create a huge problem for industry because the limits are too low in these countries. And so they're working actively to get the limits raised because the 5G network rollout would be impossible. And you see here, what you see is an image of the plume, because what 5G consists of is 1,000 MIMO antennas, that's multiply in, multiply out. 1,000 small cells packed into one thing that can simultaneously send and receive signals. And that's why you'll be able to download movies in an instant. And 70% of the internet today is from movies and video games and things like virtual reality pornography. 70%. There are no 5G phones now. They don't exist. So the marketing of this, that it's going to make your phones work better, there's a little other secret of it. Yes, your phones will work better, but you're going to have to buy new ones. You're going to have to buy new phones to get them to get this high speed that they're talking about with 5G. But the things that will work are your washing machine and your dryer and your coffee maker and your refrigerator and anything else that is already 5G ready. You'll be able to call into your home and get your coffee made. But the price you may pay for that is your exposure to levels of radiation that have never been tested for safety. And I'm going to show you next, there are reasons for concern about it. And in addition, your privacy, because it's very easy to hack into a system that is wireless as opposed to wired. And that is why we recommend that within your own home, you try to use wires as opposed to wireless for many different reasons. One is security in terms of your privacy, and the other is security in terms of your health. For example, the next slide I'm showing is Professor Paul Ben-Ishai and Yuri Feldman, who are physicists in Hebrew University, and they have shown that the sweat glands act as helical antennas. Well, why is that of any interest? Because that same technology is being used in order to create a weapon of crowd control. The same frequency is being used at a higher power, and it can act as a toxin. It can accelerate the growth of cancer cells. So 5G has biological effects. It can accelerate the growth of bacteria and viruses. So here is the active denial system of crowd control that is being used by the Department of Defense. And let me go back, and we should get the video working here. This is the Department of Defense website of non-lethal weapons. And I think non-lethal weapons personally are a great idea, because you're not going to kill people. You're just going to make them feel like their skin is on fire. Let me see if I can get it. No, it's not working on the, we'll have it on our website, and for some reason here, it's not coming into the video that I wanted to get on this. Somehow it's blacked on my screen. So scientists are doing something very unusual here. And I should add that it's a great risk to themselves to do it. Because if a scientist who has spent her life working in science, as I have, runs the risk of speaking out on behalf of what they believe to be a serious problem, she also runs the risk of being considered not a scientist, but an activist. And I have recently been told that because I am speaking out with over 220 experts in the field and calling for a moratorium on the rollout of 5G, this means I'm not being a scientist. But I want to assure you that peer-reviewed research is at the core of this recommendation, which has been led by Martin Blank, who unfortunately died last year, and Joel Moskowitz at Berkeley, among others, who are organizing those who know the literature to say that we know enough to take steps to protect ourselves now. Now, I want to remind you that the tobacco chiefs swore before Congress. They said that there was no evidence linking tobacco to cancer in 1994. We realized the folly of that, and that there had been efforts to systematically suppress science that showed that there was dangers. And unfortunately, in my book, Disconnect, I document similar efforts that have taken place by some of the cell phone industry. But again, I think the French are ahead because they are making phones with less radiation, they are changing software, and phones are being recalled and improved. And I want to thank my colleagues in France, Marc Arazi and Annie Sasko, for leading the effort through something that is called PhoneGate Alert, to make sure people in France are aware that phones cannot safely be used in the ways that people do use them now, because they exceed the test standards. So what can you do? Well, we know that children are using phones in ways that are really not safe. Look at that virtual reality piece right there. Look at the child with the phone in the mouth, or the phone in the bra, or on the body. Industry itself says this is not safe. It can exceed the guidelines. And yet, people have no idea that the information is there, buried inside the phones. I want you to see this little video that I think explains why it's so important for people to take steps here.
Did you know that cell phone, the one in your pocket, emits radio frequency radiation? As long as your phone's turned on, even if you're not talking or texting. The American Academy of Pediatrics, in over a dozen countries, recommends reducing children's exposure to wireless radiation. When using a cell phone, I always keep it away from my body. I use speakerphone or a headset like this. To stop microwave exposure, I put my phone on airplane mode and turn off Wi-Fi and Bluetooth function.
I hold the phone at a distance and make sure it's not touching my body.
Cell phones are not toys. Children's brains and bodies are still developing and are vulnerable to wireless radiation. Practice safe and responsible habits with yourself and your children. When using the computer, I always try to make sure my connection is corded, not wireless. Remember not to use your cell phone in the car. The phone works at higher power in metal surroundings and bounces around, increasing your family's radiation exposure. For their safety. For your safety.
Because children are more vulnerable.
Remind them. Remind yourself.
To limit your microwave radiation exposures. Probably the most important thing I did. I was involved as a young scientist in the committee that actually reviewed the data and recommended that there be no smoking on airplanes. You may be shocked to hear that it was even a question for science at the time, but it was. And when I looked at what we know now about mobile phone radiation, I see some very interesting similarities.
Growing number of prominent doctors and scientists are raising warning flags over radiation this morning, and your kids could be facing a greater risk of exposure.
I think the most important study is a study by the National Toxicology Program. You know, classic, large carcinogenicity test, one of the largest ever performed, for that matter, one of the most expensive. They found increased risk of the tumors, which we believe radiofrequency radiation is causing in man. Particular tumors called schwannomas. In the rats, they were in the heart. In humans, they're often in the nerve, the ear nerve, the vestibular nerve.
Cell phone providers say they follow all safety guidelines put into place by the FCC. The current FCC safety standard was developed nearly 20 years ago.
The manufacturers actually tell people in the instruction manual, which I've never read, not to put the cell phone against your ear.
It does say exactly that. There's the BlackBerry, for example, warns to keep your phone at least 0.98 inches away from the body when transmitting. With an iPhone, for example, it's 5/8 of an inch.
So those videos are available on our website. Local movie theaters around the country are showing the first one as a public service. And I would invite anyone on the call here to see if your local movie theaters will show them as a public service. Not the second one, but the first, which is an original of Environmental Health Trust. Now, what we know because of all of this is that not only do we want to reduce exposures to young women who might not be aware that you don't ever want to keep a phone in your bra, even if the bra is designed with a special pocket, unless it's on airplane mode or off. You want to reduce non-ionizing electromagnetic radiation exposures, especially during pregnancy, especially toward the end when the head and the spinal cord are exposed. A study by my colleague Di-Kun Lee at Kaiser Permanente actually measured different exposures, not the microwave exposure, but just general electromagnetic field exposures, and was able to show that mothers with the highest levels of exposure during their pregnancy had higher levels of miscarriage and more problems with their children afterwards, including asthma, as well as obesity and abnormal thyroids. So because of this and other work, the Baby Safe Project has developed, and this is an effort to provide information to women that has been spearheaded by more than 250 physicians and researchers who share the concern of Dr. Hugh Taylor, who is the chief of obstetrics at Yale Hospital, that we need to be deeply concerned and should reduce exposures, particularly to the pregnant abdomen. And there on the right, you see a list of things that are recommended by the Baby Safe Project. And again, you can find the Baby Safe Project website. You can find all of this and more on our website. So what do you do at home? Get a corded landline. It will be safe when storms hit. If you can get a landline, it's a much better thing to do. And it should be corded because wireless is exposing you and your family to unnecessary radiation. Besides, you all experience now the frustrations of calls being dropped, which will happen increasingly with wireless phones because the wireless signal cannot get through many things. If it's raining out, if the trees are very wet with snow, your wireless signal can be blocked. So you must connect with wires, yes, these old-fashioned wires, and when building homes or renovating, make sure that you leave the outlet so that you have the capacity to do it. But even if you don't, on our website, there's information about how you can use a wired phone with a cable TV connection, with a splitter that you can find information on from our website. So the basic rules are, get the phone off your body, not in your pants, not in your bra. And we have information and cards available on this that you can download and print and distribute. And we're happy to have more people share this information by doing that. Children should not use phones except in emergencies. And I know many of you have given phones to your children, but you need to really rethink it for the sake of their health, like the American Academy of Pediatrics says, particularly for young children, but also for their ability to learn and to function. There's growing evidence that this interferes with education. And we need to rethink what we're doing with many of this in our effort to promote these things in our schools. You want to create a sleep sanctuary because blue light and electromagnetic fields disrupt healthy sleep. I've shown you the theory, I've shown you some of the data, and I think it's important to remember you want to unplug and get things out of your bedroom, because if you sleep in total darkness, you will make more melatonin. And if you don't have the opportunity to sleep in darkness for one reason or another, get a sleep mask, and that will help you tremendously. And if you have the ability to turn off your Wi-Fi at night, do that. But do not sleep with your phone, because even though you're sleeping, you're not getting the deep delta rhythm sleep that your brain needs. It's disrupted by this exposure. With tablets, they're called tablets because they belong on tables. And make sure that you plug in. These are some of the safety cards that are available from us. And we really encourage you to please distribute these materials. We're working with doctors around the world now who are handing out these materials. We have them available in several languages on our site. And they basically take the safety information that manufacturers are giving you and put it together here with what physicians are advising. Other resources that you can look at will include, in addition to our website, Physicians for Safe Technology, an activity by Dr. Christine Russell at Stanford, the Bioinitiative Report, which was a huge achievement in 2007 that pulled together all the science at that time and has updated since. Grassroots Environmental Education, which is spearheading a number of activities with working with teacher unions, and the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition, which I'm very grateful to, has an upcoming module for high school teachers, which we hope will be widely used to promote awareness of the need to take precautions for kids. And finally, my colleague, Dr. Joel Moskowitz at Berkeley and Cece Doucette right there in Massachusetts are doing a great job of educating the public about this complex issue. Thank you very much. I think we'll have time for a few questions.
Dr. Davis, thank you. And we do have a couple of questions. The first, and this has come up from several of our listeners, if you could speak briefly about the role of wireless headphones and Bluetooth technology. We've had a number of people who have written in while you were speaking to ask specifically if this provides any safety, or if on the flip side, we've had some people express concern that there is additional health risks in using these devices. Could you speak to that?
Well, Bluetooth is many times less exposure than a cell phone. Bluetooth is much lower, right? And if Bluetooth goes through your car, then you're using the car roof as an antenna, and that is going to really provide a safer way to use a phone in a car. If you don't use it that way, you're getting the signal bouncing all over the place as in a microwave oven, and you're magnifying exposures. So try to avoid doing that. Bluetooth is less exposure, but there are people who are sensitive to this exposure, and for them, Bluetooth is unbearable. And I would say that the safest exposure is no exposure. So although I know, for example, that the new headphones from Apple that I'm sure people are going to lose, those headphones I really cannot endorse, because I have seen no data on whether they work by going through the brain, which would be a frightening idea, frankly. And I'm very concerned because it's the cumulative integrative exposures that we have to be concerned about. It's not just one time. And in fact, those who are listening who are concerned about what they may have done to themselves, let me assure you that the DNA repair that you can get from melatonin and other things can be very helpful to those of you who have used phones heavily in ways that I believe are not safe. So Bluetooth is less exposure, but for a long term, I really think a wired headset, speakerphone are the safest way to go.
And to follow up on that, we did have several people who also inquired about melatonin as a supplement and the potential usefulness of that prescription. Right. Would that be of value?
Well, I am not a physician, as you know, but there is there's a really robust literature suggesting that melatonin can be very useful to reduce the rate of recurrence for breast cancer and prostate cancer, and for a number of other types of cancer. It is called an oncostatic agent for that reason. And so I would say talk to your physicians. But yes, it may make a great deal of sense. But of course, you can only take it at night because it does make you very sleepy.
Terrific. I'm going to try and squeeze in one more question because this has come up again from several people who wanted to know, what is the cell phone manufacturer's reaction been to the scientific data that's being put out and to any of the ordinances or initiatives that are being taken by towns and cities to reduce cell phone exposure?
Well, first of all, industry is not monolithic. And I can tell you that people in industry have reached out to me, but they're not allowed or encouraged to do that. And it's clear that when they come up with safer phones, they're going to make billions of dollars. The problem is a legal problem because they are currently facing lawsuits from people who have been injured, brain cancer and perhaps some breast cancer as well. And if they publicly acknowledge that they have phones now with less radiation, which they are working on and for which they have patents, then it creates legal vulnerability. And I have to say that I have advised those who are filing lawsuits because I believe that they are entitled to compensation. And for some, it's been a rather tragic situation. I know of several cases of young men who have died from cell phone use. And I believe that's what was the cause of their death. I think it's very difficult when it comes to an individual to be able to prove what was the cause of their cancer. But the evidence at this point is overwhelming. We have human data that I showed you from a number of places, over 9 case control studies. We have experimental data from the National Toxicology Program and many other scientists around the world showing this causes cancer in animals. So when you have someone like Jimmy Gonzalez, who develops a brain cancer at age 34 and unfortunately dies a few years later, you have really strong reasons to believe that his cancer was associated with his unusual and heavy cell phone use. The same is true for Brett Bocook. The same is true for a number of others I could name, where they were extremely heavy users as real estate agents or attorneys. And as a consequence, they've developed a brain cancer. There are some amazing survivors, like Alan Marks, bless him. But most people don't do so well. And as a consequence, we've really got to do a better job of preventing exposures now. That's what we have to do. And I think you can work now in your homes and your families to reduce your exposures. We have information. These other sites here have information as well. And there are building biologists who are expert in how to reduce exposures. And they're in Massachusetts as well as around the world. And we all need to work together to recognize the importance of reducing our exposures now, rather than insisting that we need more proof of human harm.
Dr. Davis, I want to thank you. You have given us a tremendous amount to think about and some valuable information. And I'd like to say on behalf of Cheryl Asimo, NBCC's Executive Director, and our Board of Directors, I thank you for taking the time to speak with us today, and I thank all of our many listeners for joining us. I know there is a great deal of interest in this topic and in this webinar, and I wanted to let everyone know that a recording will be made available later today on the NBCC website, and you can visit www.nbcc.org. Dr. Davis, thank you. Thank you to our listeners, and have a good afternoon.